Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this session of the Rise of Privacy Tech Virtual Summit. Thank you so much for Lourdes and all the folks that are involved in this conference to allow us to speak today. My name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. I'm the CEO, founder, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. And today we have Michael Boulos, who is the COO of Blotout. Hello, Matthew. I'm sorry, Matthew.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah. So the session that we're going to be talking about today is about privacy's real world ROI, right? So when a lot of people think of privacy, especially a lot of companies, they think of it as an additional regulatory burden, almost a tax. So I think this session we can kind of tease through a lot of ideas about how privacy in the real world can have a good return on investment. And maybe we should start out by talking about what you see as kind of the privacy issues du jour, or the trends that you're seeing in privacy that would sort of move people towards this idea of return on investment.
Yeah, no, I really like your framing, and I think one of the things that when we think about, privacy, right? Layer one, sort of the moral, ethical obligation. Layer two, not mucking up on a regulatory front, and then layer three is sort of is there actually something strategic, something beneficial, right? And what we're watching, right? If we look at these major disruptive trends, right, we're seeing we clump them into three groups. One is around just data loss. So right now, if you get privacy wrong, someone's running an ad blocker, a privacy browser, Safari is going to limit the attribution window. Your ability to have a one-to-one relationship with your end user, in the negative construction that gets hampered, and that's of course where there's going to be the really big opportunity. You get that right. What data are you actually able to see once more because you have a trusted relationship? The second that we're observing is just the idea of how limited the relationships companies had built. When you didn't actually maintain a relationship with your customer and you relied on a third-party tracker to do it, it really encumbered what you could do. So now we're starting to see the best-of-breed companies come out of the gate and say, you know what, these are our relationships. We're going to manage them. We're going to respect them. But then you have these huge loyalty dividends that come from them in terms of activation, really understanding your user, and also the brand lift. And then the last is around what happens when you actually follow consent and expectations. And I think, consent's one of the trickier ones because I think anytime you have to ask for it, you're not going to get it. So that one to a large extent is about asking the question of, what activities do I really need to be doing with the data? What purposes am I going for? And am I able to actually think through consent in a way that I'm actually driving the business results I need without adding this unnecessary friction? I think, the cynical take is that consent's been somewhat abused and not fully respected in the last couple of years, but that's starting to get teeth. And so thinking about how you fit that into the framework is, we'd say would be the last space that or the third space that you'd want to be thinking about when you're thinking about how am I going to actually make this give me a proper return rather than how do I not muck up.
Right. And so I'm going to take it up a level, actually. So what I'm seeing in terms of shifting in the privacy realm is companies trying to limit their third-party risk, right, by limiting the amount of data that they get at third parties, which is fine. Companies with first-party relationships want to maintain those relationships and maintain that trust. So they are trying to give less data to third parties, but it makes it harder for third parties now to develop almost a first-party relationship. So then the idea of consent comes into view, and consent can mean many things. I tell people you can't sell your limbs legally or your organs, but that's about it in terms of consent. So companies can ask a lot of things of individuals, but I think, some some companies are going to be at a grave disadvantage because they did not have that, they were almost invisible, right, to consumers or other businesses. So they don't have that ability, I don't think, to be able to build those first party relationships where or having that trust. So I think, I really like what you're doing with your tool, where you're kind of thinking through that scenario in those relationships and figuring out how companies, as instead of privacy being a tax, this is how you can respect the rights of individuals and do business, as a company, earn money while you're kind of respecting privacy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I think, one of the, we often asked, how many times does Google or Uber send really valuable data to a third party to work with it? I'm sure there's instances where they do, but that's really not how they go about it. They know the data is valuable. They're capturing it themselves. They're ingesting it. They're doing the data engineering, and they're able to build like very powerful things on top of that. Now, they're maybe not the best examples to trot out for, for necessarily carrying it all the way down the privacy value chain, but just from a data engineering and from the value of the data, being able to capture it yourself and being able to enrich that one-to-one relationship that you have with your end user, there is no substitute for doing it yourself. The problem is that it is incredibly hard to do that. And the reason I mentioned Google and Uber is because they have these massive engineering teams, and most companies just simply don't. Something that we've seen, when we've talked to companies trying to build their own data engineering capabilities to, take something like analytics, to drop Google Analytics or Amplitude and actually do it in-house and just capture that can be upwards of $500,000 to $1 million a year in engineering talent on just being able to get kind of the foundational stuff in place. And so the way we see it is that the privacy shifts are going to force you to do it yourself or to abandon. So, do you accept incomplete analytics? Do you accept that you don't understand your users? Do you accept all those holes, or you build it yourself? There really is no, there is no third option. There's nothing that a third party tracker can do to become compliant. It's just definitionally they're out. And so that's what makes these shifts by both Apple with WebKit and intelligent tracking prevention, ATT, all of these things, and Google and the obsolescence of the third-party cookie. That's what makes these such dramatic changes, because they're basically just killing a model, and those things are gone. And then you choose. You're like, what am I going to do now? So everybody's on the same page. Everybody's subject to the same dynamics, but it's the companies that say, okay, you know what? We're going to have this capability ourselves, and that's what prompted us. That's really what brought Blotout into being. We asked, okay, so we've got all of these things coming online to protect the user, and we can over beers have a conversation about whether it's enough and where it should go and all of that, but you have all these user protections coming into being and getting teeth, and then there's no software, and that's not a fair articulate, but there's very little in the way of info for companies to be able to respond to that. So the idea behind Blotout was to say, well, if Google could have a data engineering capability, could you build that capability? Could you give that as software to companies to use? And if we're going to be in a privacy first world, then could you actually weave privacy? And when we say privacy, it's such a wide thing, but it's consent and purpose limitation, auditing, alarms around data moving in places it shouldn't, governance, those sorts of things. Could you actually weave that by design into the fabric of it? And that's the idea behind Blotout. And that's why we get so excited about the ROI here, because if you capture it yourself, your competitor is now seeing X% of their users, if they're tracking customer journeys, you're seeing 100%. And that sort of a differentiator is massive. And when we think about more complex applications, publisher networks that would have relied in the past on third-party tracking to even be able to monetize their visitors, they start to construct clean rooms, those sorts of things. They get the business continuity. They get the ability to actually leverage the data that they're allowed to use and work with, whereas the rest of the market gets left behind. And that's really where we see the differentiation coming.
So you touched on the death of the third party cookie, which I agree. So cookies aren't going away, but I think the way that third parties are been using cookies is going away. So what's happening now is that it's forcing more transparency, right? And then other first party companies are forcing third party companies to get consent from individuals to actually do that level of tracking. So tell me exactly, I know we had talked previously and I thought it was really fascinating where you said that how your tool plays in the space where a lot of people use things like Google Analytics. So I feel like so many people use it, and we talked about this. A lot of people don't know how to use it or how to limit the data. It's so much. So talk to me a little bit about what your tool does in that area.
Yeah, so like this is so let's take, like, we'll do Debbie.com, right? And you want to run your analytics. So you drop a script, a Google Analytics script in your site. I visit your site, a first-party cross-site cookie gets set, and then we send my, the events related to my visit to Google Analytics. At the end of the week, you want to see how your site did that week, you go to Google Analytics and take a look. So the disruption that's hitting is that I'm neurotic. I've got, ad blockers, FF, privacy badger, and whatever. So that's blocked. So the really fascinating thing is that the Google Analytics script will try to send my information to Google. It will get a response that it was a successful transmitter, but in fact nothing. It has been blocked. At my device, it hasn't gone anywhere. So now you've got this big gap. So how do you fix that? So the idea behind Blotout is it's software that you're going to install in your infrastructure. So it's going to be within your cloud. And so where you manage your own data lake, it's going to sit on top of that. So now the script that you put in your site is not a Google script, it's a Debbie.com script. And that's going to send it back to your own infra. So just the same way an API call will be privileged the way any other call, because that's a first party relationship. You have every right to do that. None of these blockers are blocking it, not because they can't see, because they've, that philosophically, this is the sound.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. So what ends up happening, right? And so software, you install it within your infrastructure. You've got the, any data that you're capturing is being captured into your own lake. And at the most minimal level, you could just one for one swap out Google Analytics with Blotout, and now you have a complete analytics platform that doesn't miss anything. But where this starts to get a lot more exciting is that if all we were was, swap out for Google Analytics, it wouldn't be a fun story. But it's now, this is a data engineering platform. So we can ingest data from anywhere. So now, let's say you run transactions on your site, use Stripe. We could actually pull from Stripe, do the ETL into that. So now in your Blotout instance, you actually could tie my visit to the transactional data. You can start actually seeing something like, what's the customer journey of an average contract size? Something you just couldn't do in the Google Analytics world. You weren't going to take your Stripe data and send it off to another party. You can't really join those sorts of things in the third-party ecosystem in a way you can when it sits within your own infrastructure. And so that's the promise here, is that it's not just the data loss. So we solve the data loss. We need a complete view as a starting point, but then we have the opportunity to use all of our data sources so we can ingest from ETL. But the other thing that you can do is you can have just your transactional databases. So you can actually pull those in as well. So now you're tying events, any of the tools that you're using in your own transactions, all together in one spot. Then you can start asking really interesting questions about how all of these things interact. So to give you an example, like a real world example of how this plays out, we had a customer that was having support tickets or failed transactions in a particular geography, and they didn't understand what was going on. In fact, they had for a period of time just assumed that users in that geography were tailing off at the checkout or at the the final stage. What they found a few weeks later was that at the same time support tickets were piling up from that geography, and the person assigned to the support ticket was no longer with the company. So they had a process failure. And what happened is that something was broken with the product. So the users were trying to complete the transaction, failing, putting in a support ticket was getting ignored, and they lost all of those conversions from that geography. What they're doing now is taking support tickets and customer journeys, unifying the events and the tickets, and so that they're actually able to have a single data set, so they can, if they're seeing an odd pattern, they can actually just troubleshoot without it being a fishing expedition. And something we're excited about, and and sort of like the midterm vision is actually to start building out ML models that help you start drawing the correlations, so that we can actually anticipate the correlations for you even before, so you don't have to go hunting for them. But that's the sort of thing that you couldn't do if your data was spread all over the place. The data loss, it kind of forced you then to figure out how you're not going to lose the data. But once you then have it all in one spot, the unification and analytics possibilities become just so much richer. And I think it's worth, the other thing worth asking was, like, pre-privacy changes, why did we depend so heavily on the third-party ecosystem if it's just so much less efficient? And the argument is that it's just really convenient. Like, if you're starting out today and to do analytics, all you do is add a script, and in a lot of cases you're not even paying, right? You're on a free tier and you build up. It's easy to get hooked on that. And one of the things that's fascinating for us is to watch when we have conversations, particularly companies Series A and beyond, or Series B and beyond, that they're often like, this was really nice last year, this is horrible right now, but you're so bought into a model. So one of the interesting things here is, how do you break free of a model that was fun while it lasted, and then it's now starting to yield fewer and fewer dividends?
The party is definitely over for that, I think. So let's talk a bit about tools in a privacy first world. So I feel like the tools that are going to win the day in the future are going to be the ones that build privacy in is baked in the cake, right? It's part of the foundation of what happens with tools. But let's talk about it. A lot of times, especially in privacy, when companies want to obtain a tool, obviously there are a lot of different stakeholders in that conversation. So how would you recommend someone communicate what the return on investment would be to maybe a high level person, maybe the CEO of a company that doesn't understand privacy or doesn't understand cyber, or doesn't, how would you talk to that person about the return on investment?
We always start with a business purpose, and then explain how we're able to achieve it, and then explain how privacy actually is advantageous. So let's take, again, let's take the product manager. You've got a product, you have your customer journeys. The most basic level, your data is incomplete. At a widening that, they're just things that you cannot answer today. That would be very important. So, you talk to, a company that depends on Segment might actually be spending huge amounts of money to warehouse the data. So they may actually, we're talking to companies that are just opting out of historical data because it's simply too expensive to hang on to. So we start with that. And, and it's sort of like, it's like a crass, has nothing to do with privacy story, right? It's like, you need X, you don't have X. So let's talk about how we get you there. And then the next step is that this is an architectural shift. To put it plainly, we're basically saying, if you respect the user and you actually structure the data relationship with the user correctly, you get all these dividends. You don't, it doesn't work. And that's and that explains the architectural shift. That's why you've got to take it in-house. That's why, it's not like cloud native with a cloud option. It is the whole point is install it in your infrastructure. It is your data. You're not sending data off somewhere else. But the last layer, and the really critical one, is that by getting the privacy decisions correct at the point of ingestion, at the point, like first point of interaction, and carrying it all the way through, you reduce the risk dramatically. And so what we find is that, and what I mean by that is, like, in the Blotout universe, no data point is ever collected without associated consent and purpose. And then every interaction with the data is audited. And then there's governance, role column level governance around who and what, can access that, and then alarms for any data that's getting pushed out that could go somewhere else. But the reason that I bring that up last is because you've got to hook somebody. They have to understand what the actual business opportunity is. They have to understand how, because it's too easy to sell, anything, right? How do they know that this will actually work? And then how do they know it's safe? And that construction is exactly how you then bring the story to the rest of the organization. Because what you do is you say, look, we need this particular capability. This tool will give it to us. The CTO is like, okay, so let's talk. I want to understand how this will work. That's where the architecture comes in. So one of the things we find is that almost immediately we find the CTO or the engineering team brought into this conversation. Anything that touches data and invariably is going to involve them. But do you get the CSO, or are you getting the chief privacy officer? Who else is coming to the table on that? That's where the privacy ethos is what then gives it the stability. But we find these are multi-stakeholder conversations and engagements, but as somebody bringing it into their organization, we work really hard to give them the tools to be able to explain how they're not just going to get the business benefit, but how it benefits everybody along the way.
Yeah, and also, I would say I love the story when you were talking about you had a customer that had they couldn't figure out what was happening in a particular geography, and a lot of times some people assume wrongly that an absence of data or information about something means something totally different. So, like you were saying, they interpret it without connecting the data. That probably people in that geography were less interested in their product, and actually that wasn't true. They just had, like you said, a process issue. So talk a little, I like the way you're talking about connecting the data together, being able to kind of tell that story. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that's really sort of the magic and joy of data engineering, right? Like when we talk about data engineering, to date, most of that has been as a verb, like it's something a skilled engineer in that field does, right? So this is really about, are we setting the right IDs? Are we managing those correctly? Are we able to take these disparate data sets and say, here's how they can align? So that's something that Blotout, that's sort of like one of its core capabilities. So for every data stream coming in, so whether it's events, your ETL, or even just replicating a database, what we do is we put a privacy ID on that. And so that could be in the case of, you are, say, using Stripe for your transactions. Can you put a privacy ID on that? And why I say privacy ID is that it's too easy to be kind of sloppy on that and just have a common ID so you can unify it at some later point. But if there's ever a breach at any of these providers, you don't want that then to expose that user. And so, but by getting those decisions right and then pulling all of it together, what you end up having are these just essentially queryable data that has already had all the joins. Like if you think of like anybody's like kind of first few years of their career where they have to look at Excel and make things work together that just no innocent person should have to deal with. I mean, that's the problem that the unification step solves. But once it's unified, that's when we pull it into the workspaces. So what you have are these, so there's a marketing workspace or a product or an engineering workspace that allow you to actually start answering the questions in very specific ways. So that really is the heart of it, is how do you pull all that together?
Yeah, great. I would love to talk about data monetization. So monetization is controversial, right, in some ways, especially for people who are very much purists about data and selling and stuff like that. Especially, I have this with my European friends who don't feel like data should be sold, but I think that train has left the station quite many years ago, right? So data is sold by people, and it's just depending on who benefits from that data. And also, I guess I want to talk about it in two ways. One is I feel like we're going into the age of data monetization, especially if third parties feel like they don't have that customer trust. They have to find some way to try to get that relationship. And then the other side, not necessarily data monetization, but maybe trust monetization, I would say. And this is kind of what Apple is doing, where they're saying we have these rich first party relationships let's have people trust us, and they're going to share more data with us, and we're going to be more profitable. So I think it's not a coincidence that once Apple started pushing a lot of their privacy stuff, like their fourth quarter of 2020 was one of their most profitable quarters that they've ever had as a company. So talk to me a little bit about those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I love trust monetization as sort of a way of characterizing it, and almost I think data monetization is like a subset of that. I think the starting point around what can you do, to your point about, you can't sell your organs, but you can basically consent to just about anything else. And those are very powerful policy decisions, right? And I think they're, as individuals, as a team of a bunch of privacy junkies, like, we have really strong opinions on those. But then as a company, our posture on that is that a company, enterprises that are going to think about using data need to do so in a rigorous way that actually genuinely earns and operates within the context of user trust. And so there's a few things that stand out from there. There's when we look at a regulation like CPRA, one of the most interesting things about the CPRA is the blending of the distinction between selling and sharing, and taking just very seriously what happens with the data. So one of the things that we're starting to observe is there is the Apple effect. So if you own the platform, then you kind of have sort of earned the right by owning the platform. So then there's a really interesting question here of, you could, if you're Apple, that's magnificent. If you're not Apple, but let's say you're a you're like a widget that consumers choose, let's say like a checkout widget or something like that a consumer chooses to does their payment, does your checkout with. You can actually start to build other platforms. And then if you actually have the one-to-one relationship with that end user, you start to get the platform effects as well. So just from the challenge there is to not muck it up. And so, because you are going to have to ask for consent, you are going to have to respect that. But one of the really interesting things that we're observing is that I think a lot of almost platforms are beginning to realize that if they have built that relationship, then they should leverage that. But that a lot of the things that have inhibited that is that they had done things that would make them not trust it. And I think that's what's exciting here, is that you now have a chance. And let's be really explicit. What does trusted mean? It means that you really, when you ask for consent, you don't do dark patterns. Somebody can go in and see and modify what, they're permitting at any given point in time. And the other part of it is then make it valuable. So I think everything that Brave does always ends up being controversial, but it's interesting that there are people who find, for instance, the Brave attention token to be a really interesting, an interesting trade-off, right? That I choose to accept that monetization. We could see that with other platform possibilities for that emerging. I think the regulation and user behavior now have kind of impose the guardrails on that to some extent. So then we, again, there's an interesting policy debate about, are the guardrails strong enough? Are they good enough? But companies now actually have a framework that they can start approaching trust and data monetization. And whether that's like explicitly, I will give you my information in return for you to put a few cents in a wallet for me, versus let you flog, discounts or something like that at the checkout. But those things can actually work. I mean, I'm very sad about like the death of the paper coupon. I loved going to the supermarket when I was a teenager and hand that off. But like, to a large extent, the things became so opaque that, we were getting priced differently and all sorts of things that I think it's a chance to bring a lot of that back and the transparency into that. So that's, I think, where the opportunity is. But I think we're also early days on that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. And then, I feel like, especially once the privacy regulations come up, a lot of companies sort of saw this as, oh my God, this is like just another regulation that we have to deal with or whatever. But I think being able to flip it on the other side and say, if you have a good relationship with your customer, not only will they share data with you, they'll share more accurate data, and they'll probably share more data with you if they feel like the benefit is there. So I think part of that is trying to, sort of change what I consider like a very asymmetrical relationship right now. What are your thoughts about that?
No, that's right. That's right. I mean, I think is that like kind of everybody was here with the data that they had, but it was kind of fishy how it was happening. The privacy shifts just reduced how much data is there. Now there's a chance to do it correctly, get that data back up, and then there are new business models that are possible. So with a lot of the trust and data monetization, we're in the space of new business models. And I think there's like, I mean, one of the really interesting observations for us is just in the D2C space is how, and take kind of these taglines for what they're worth, but like, CAC doesn't matter, loyalty is everything. But like something like that is, other than being a little overstated, it is actually powerful because loyalty really does matter to these brands, for D2C brands. And that's just one example area. But yeah, we are seeing, we are watching shifts in how companies realize that they could manage the relationship. And the other thing is there's quality of data, but there's also just stuff you would never share if it wasn't trusted. So if you think of a health app, there are things that Apple's bet with its health play is that you're going to share more with Apple than you might anyone else because they came out of the gate and said privacy matters. And then you don't know who's, sending off, your catalog of back pain incidents, right? If it's a consumer app, there's no sort of HIPAA thing on that. It's a Wild West. And so what I'm excited to see are what are the new business models. We're already seeing kind of the first set, particularly among publishers and in the e-commerce space, where it's kind of a bit obvious what you would do if you gutted the old model. You just have to rebuild it. What will be interesting will be what are the new products that get built when the customer can actually trust that you're not doing something goofy with their data.
Yeah. And also a lot of enterprise applications before a lot of these regulations came out, they were, the internet was built to share information, not to secure it, right? And also a lot of these enterprise solutions were built to remember information and not to forget it. So I think those are two big shifts that are happening.
Yeah. And I think that's, one of the points about remembering everything is that the data is often junk. Right. Like, I mean, this is the thing is like, at any given point in time, the profiles that exist about us are just kind of absurd. Like, apparently I like cooking turkey and, sports cars, right? Like, this is what, like, if you were to track through the last few weeks of and things and just the way we skip across devices about. So there in the free for all to collect data, the quality was not there. What happens in the trusted context is that you actually have a chance to get the quality right. And I think that to us is probably the most interesting thing that we're watching. It's the direct benefit of it is that your data is good, but there's also just a much bigger story of what happened. What do you build when you can trust the data versus what are you building just, because you have stuff scattered all over the place.
Right, exactly. And so, again, I'll use that example about absence of data giving you wrong information. So if a profile says you like turkey, maybe that's the only thing they know that you like, and they think that's that's Matthew's favorite thing is turkey. That's the only thing he eats is turkey or whatever. And we know that that's not true, right?
No, and that's but that's the thing that I think, particularly to the point about the platform business models, are getting really interesting. So even if you have even a minimal platform, but you have these one-to-one relationships, those just get to be much richer than anything else. The other thing is that you get to acknowledge what you know. And I think this is a really important part. So like in the context of ad targeting, we set aside sort of the normative issues around what does it mean to track someone all over the internet. What they were really trying to do is kind of have plausible monetizability, right? Like, they're essentially saying, we know enough about this guy, let's show him this ad, here's the price, and that's, I think that's giving way to saying, we know that, at checkout, Matthew's bought the following other things, and it is okay that we know that because we've got this one-to-one relationship with him. And so are we going to, in another channel, promote to him something, or are we going to offer him the discount to get this conversion to actually happen? That's something that gets a lot more interesting and a lot richer when we're out of the space of these, half pictures, and now how do you form these complete pictures, but pictures that are acceptable to the end user?
Yeah. And then how do we, I feel like, and maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, I feel like companies hopefully are switching from being reactive about privacy to being proactive and understanding how foundational that is, but then also moving from the idea that privacy is a tax to privacy can be a value and can add to the bottom line of your organization. Are you seeing this shift, or am I just wishfully thinking this?
No, but you captured it exactly right. I mean, I think what I would say is that let's just add kind of like a 3 to 6 month lag time on each of your steps. Because like when it was very interesting in September. I remember distinctly a number of calls, and chats with people where they're like, "Oh, do you really think Google's going to actually kill the third-party cookie?" I'm like, they have published this. Like, how are you like, their announcement, like just a couple of months ago was simply to say, that blog post we did a year ago, yep, we still agree. We're still going to do it, right? It wasn't a new announcement, but I think there was a very long time or the long chunk of time in which people were sort of either didn't understand what was going on or just didn't believe that the changes were coming. Now that that's happened, really the big challenge is the educational step. Can you do something differently? And I think one of the splits that we are seeing is that certain industries are, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, are just low tech. So if you're a publisher, it is conceivable to basically have like a bare bones engineering team, right? Like, you are using a series of products. E-commerce is very similar, right? One of the ways that what we realize is like a Shopify house may actually not be ready because they just don't have the technical wherewithal to understand even what was happening with the data in the first place. So there is, do people actually believe that anything's changed? I think that's starting to give way. I don't think that, I think I'm somewhat optimistic on this, but one of the things I'm noticing is that a lot more of our conversations are now like, we need your help, rather than like, tell me why you think the world's going to change, right? So we've seen that shift palpably in the last number of months. What's interesting is who gets it and who doesn't get it from a solution space. But that's also, I think, this is one of the largest shifts in terms of data in the internet, just in an exceptionally long period of time. So to assume overnight understanding, I think would be lovely, but I think a little too optimistic. But rather, I think there is going to be an educational period. But it's also going to be within that same educational period is where I think a lot of the winners and losers are going to get selected because of who moves and who doesn't.
Yeah, and I think there's also a huge shakeup, a tremendous shakeup in kind of third-party data holders and people who work with companies on a third-party level. So there's going to be sort of more requirements of those people, right? And they're, for people who can't change their business model, I say that it could be like an extinction level event for them if they can't get on board with something different. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, absolutely. I think the first thing that I'd flag is that I think when we think of what's happening to third-party providers, it's kind of twofold. From a regulatory point of view, it's amazing how many third declare themselves to be whatever string of laws they want to say, we are compliant with all of these, and then you realize that they have an API call that could delete data if you wanted to, right? And so there is kind of, I think we're still having a bit of a fast and loose on the regulatory side. I think that's particularly CPRA is going to change that to a large extent. But what nobody can deny is that, if you're in Safari, like vanilla Safari, it's a 7-day attribution window. If you're running an ad blocker, that uses invisible. So there are sort of like, in a very weird way, the stick got wielded by the platforms. Much more so than the regulatory entity. So that's sort of where I think we're gonna, so we've obviously saw, like market share on, particularly ad tech guys who depend entirely on third-party cookies, like they just got gutted right? So it's clear that, you know, for a whole line of businesses, they're just sort of, they can't reinvent, they're going to be done for. You know, some cases like market cap, like less than annual revenue, like really shocking sort of sense of the end for these companies. I think for companies that depend on these third parties, that's where it gets a little more interesting, because I think, do you accept that your analytics are going to be incomplete? It depends. You know, there's some companies, you know, everybody pretends to be a data company, but who actually uses data and you know, uses it in an active or powerful way. So that's where I think it is really going to be the most interesting split. And we also think, just from publisher monetization, the future has got to be, you know, it's got to be having a relationship with your end users.
So, so we're going to wrap up here, but I would love to get your crystal ball for the future. You know, what is life going to be like in the data world, and what are you seeing probably for the next, I don't know, 12, 18, 24 months? I think it's going to be a lot of changes in the next 18 months, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's near term is just a realization that that there are gaps, that something has to be done. You know, I've had a really fun CMO chat who, you know, she's looking at her numbers, and it's just like her teams just kind of embarrassedly tell them, we just don't know what's going on here. And so that is going to give way to the, well, I need to know what's going on there. That I think is sort of like, that's going to be the business motivation. I think what's going to rapidly happen are going to be that data strong and engineering strong companies are going to start, you know, they'll have every motivation to start re-engineering these things. And I really think 3 to 5 years out, the company that care about, you know, that can really activate data can have entirely different data infrastructures that are going to be dramatically less third-party dependent. And how they construct those stacks, I think, are going to either be, you know, we're seeing the movement of just like taking, so one of the really interesting things that's happening is open cloud native just by itself, like forget privacy, just itself is becoming very strong, because if you're an engineering team and your third-party tool is failing, you want to take that in-house. You can, you know, one of the first modes of thought is just say, what are the cloud native tools out there? What our bet is that you do that and then try to patch the privacy side of things after the fact. It's going to be very painful. It's going to be an really interesting thing to see what happens as more and more of the data work goes in-house, the data collection, storage, and unification happening in-house, how the privacy overlays or how the privacy solutions fit with that. But that's really kind of how we're seeing it.
Yeah. And I also think, just to wrap it up with the whole return on investment theme, you know, it can't just be, let's implement a tool so we can't get fined or something, right?
Yeah.
So it can't be this after the fact thing. It has to be more proactive. And that proactivity, I think, will help companies gain trust with customers and people that they deal with. So I think moving proactive, obviously, you know, the prevention is less expensive than cure, right? So being able to really focus on kind of that, you know, first party, privacy first world, and doing it in a proactive manner that's going to, you know, not only help you, you know, with regulation, but also help your business. What are your thoughts about that?
And that's exactly what we believe, right? Which is if we do it right, so doing things right means that you have the appropriate relationship. It's one-to-one. Why do I have an intermediary to have, you know, that was just a technical convenience, that there's no justification for that anymore. But then if I'm going to take your data, I'm going to respect and I'm going to honor your expectations. And in return, I get the right to use that. Getting that right, it just, you know, it's demonstrably, that means you're going to get to see data you weren't able to see before. You're going to get to do more with the data. And by the way, when I say you get to do more, I don't mean as in like, Matthew consented, therefore you could do more. I mean that just from a technical capability of what you can do with the data sets, more is possible. But by getting the consent and purpose right, by getting the governance right, getting all of those things, your capability is increasing without there being some sort of ceiling on that, or the risk that you're going to get slapped down. Because that's really, if you think of sort of like the previous data gold rush was, I think Eric Schmidt's quote was, we're going to get to the line of what's creepy and then we won't cross it, right? And then everybody else crossed it. And it's sort of like that's over now, right? We're not, that's not what's happening. Instead, there's a different gold rush, which is towards quality, towards completeness, towards even potential new business models that emerge from the fact that the user actually wanted the relationship with you instead of, you getting tracked for turkey for no good reason.
Well, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time, and thank you to everyone who attended the session. Thank you, Matthew.
Thanks, everyone.